Today I'm very lucky to be able to interview the new patron of the Scottish Associations of South Australia. That's Senator Andrew McLachlan.
How do you do?
Thank you, Andrew. It's great to be sitting in your office with you feeling relaxed, and we're going to talk about really your life before, during, and have a wee look after politics. So let's talk about your early life first. You were born in Adelaide, is that correct?
Yes, I was born in Adelaide in 1966 to both South Australians. My father was born in South Australia and my mother in Victoria. My father was a customs agent and the family business was in Port Adelaide, and you can still see the sign C.G. McLachlan and Co. in Lipson Street. That was started by my great-grandfather.
Right, so you've actually been South Australians way back.
Yes, the first McLachlan to come to Australia was Colin McLachlan. So Colin Graham's father, they weren't too original with names. The names are Colin Graham and John. My father is John. And he came out as a young boy, and his mother had remarried, a MacArthur, and they settled at the lighthouse at Cape Willoughby. His mother was Catherine Macmillan, and she's buried in the Heritage Cemetery in Hog Bay on Kangaroo Island. So she's the first of my blood to be here. And Colin died in South Australia after having a successful career as a sea captain, and he's buried in Enfield Cemetery.
It's fascinating listening to people remembering what their ancestors did and sort of making the link to today, way back to when it must have been very hard work.
It was. If you go to Cape Willoughby, you'll see the logbooks which have been transcribed, and his stepfather is sending him errands, and it's in the log. So I have an insight to Colin's early life, courtesy of the heritage transcriptions of the logbooks.
Also, I think it must be maybe the migrant in Australians. They're much more interested in looking back maybe than we Scots are, who we're pushed to remember past our grannies, usually.
Yes, I do have a fascination because they would have been a Gaelic-speaking family from the West Coast. His mother and father, there is some evidence that his mother was not literate, Catherine, yet he has learnt mathematics and English, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to achieve his master's certificate. So one of the great mysteries is who educated him.
Well, of course, if he went to school in Scotland, the parish schools had already been set up, so maybe we can thank John Knox for that.
We can probably thank John Knox. He left, I think, just over 9, around 10 when they came out.
And of course, the West Coast, the McLachlans or McLachlans come from Loch Fyne.
They do?
On the West Coast.
I have visited. I lived in Scotland for about a year and a half.
So you went to school in Adelaide and then made a decision to read law?
I'd have to say I wasn't personally driven for a career in the law. It was recommended by my father, as all good fathers do. In the absence of any defining passion at that time, I started to read law and I enjoyed it and entered practice at the conclusion of my degree.
So what then made you decide to go on to Edinburgh?
I worked as a young solicitor in a firm that had country offices, and I did 2 years in Port Augusta. I was then dating my now wife, Marcia, and we wanted to go overseas. I made the decision that I wanted to do a master's degree, and I decided on Edinburgh University. We were married 2 weeks before setting out, and I took Marcia to university accommodation. The first time we landed in Edinburgh, there was a heavy fog and then followed by very strong winds the next day. And we had a Glaswegian taxi driver who was very kind to us, but we could not understand him. And we weren't sure where we had arrived. And we went to our accommodation, unpacked, and decided to go to the pub for a meal. They asked us if we were Australian, and we said yes. And then they ushered us back in the rear of the pub, and they had a lock-in. And you'd have to only be an Australian to understand that you're in a lock-in. and we were down the back with a police officer and a few others. So that's my first night in Edinburgh, and a legal drink.
Right. And you did a master's in Edinburgh, is that right?
I did a Masters of Law. I wanted to do a degree in civil law, and the best degree in civil law is at Edinburgh.
I have no knowledge, really, except that English and Scots law are different. Did that matter for the masters?
No, because I studied commercial and some other associated subjects. Scottish law contractually is more continental than England, and some parts of it's criminal law. So I always fascinated in common law. You can have a contract, but you need consideration or value exchanging. In Scotland, a promise is enforceable. So there's subtle differences, but to be fair, they ended up in the same place.
And when you were in Edinburgh, joined the Territorial?
Yes, I needed a part-time job, a little bit of money, and I wanted to do mountaineering. I love my hiking, but in South Australia, you don't have much of an opportunity to experience snow walking or mountaineering in the cold, and the army was the best way. I had a fantastic time and made lifelong friends. And we did that in addition to our military training.
I think that's probably quite a good point to have a musical break. Now, you listed a couple of favourites, I suspect, from that time in Edinburgh, which was a fairly lively time. What two groups are you keen that I should select something? And I will pick things I like, of course.
Well, Runrig and especially Capercaillie, because I love them and I still do, but I became acquainted with them when I was in Edinburgh.
Okay, so we'll take a break and we'll play a track from Runrig.
In the distance, day was dawning. Comes to me the early morning. Something tells me that I'm going home. The brand new sun was shining bright. From the darkness, fields of light. Something tells me that I'm going home. Going home, where the summer's coming in, and the moonlight on the river shows me where I've been. And soft the rain's gently falling, light across the city morning. Across the moorlands, past the mountains, the river beside the new stream. Something tells me that I'm going home. Let's hear you singing. Going home, where the summer's coming in, and the moonlight on the river shows me where I've been.
That was Going Home by Runrig, because it seems a bit appropriate for Andrew McLachlan, because he's actually heading home now after his time in Edinburgh. Did you go back to the firm that you'd worked for before you went to Edinburgh to read the Masters?
No, it was the height of the recession, and I returned to South Australia unsure of whether I could gain employment, but I was fortunate a law firm picked me up within 2 weeks of landing home, for which I'm very grateful, and that was a banking and finance firm, and it was quite a transition from having done criminal and family law to being a banking and finance commercial lawyer, but I had studied a little of that when I was in Edinburgh.
So that switch, was that to your satisfaction, or was that because you got a job?
Probably the latter. In those days, a job was highly valued. It turned out to be a very fortunate decision because it led on to other parts of my career, particularly as a CEO. So this is about 93, I think.
93, that was when
Yes.
you didn't see a crane in Adelaide.
Yes, it was a difficult time, and you were just fortunate as a lawyer to have a job.
Okay, so your switch to financial services obviously worked well because you then moved on to different fields, including academia.
Yes, I did about, I think, three. I think it's around three. I don't have my CV in front of me. At the law firm, and then I was offered a job as a general counsel in a superannuation and private banking firm, which I took up. And then from there, I survived in that sort of financial services group about, I think, 3 mergers, and ended up a chief executive officer of one of the divisions. So left the law, and that was a fantastic experience, but also not without its stresses.
I'll say. After that, you then moved into University of Adelaide, was it?
Yes, I was asked to move my family to the East Coast. At that time, it didn't suit my family's circumstances, and so I decided to remain in South Australia. Of course, in the previous 5 years, I'd been heavily commuting to the East Coast. And I was effectively working on the East Coast, and that takes its toll. And I thought I needed a shift in career, and I went to the University of Adelaide as the director of the International Centre for Financial Services, and also I did a number of private directorships.
Having been a CEO, did you find the shift to academic life interesting?
Wonderful. You could have time to actually read and reflect. My time in financial services, although did set me up very well for politics.
Politics. So that, I guess, is the next phase in your life. And it was quite late in your life, relatively speaking, to make a shift to politics. What drove you?
I was increasingly involved in my own political party from an administrative perspective. I have a very strong sense of the rights of the individual, and at that time I had very different views on law and order policies from the then Labor government. I didn't really think the tough on crime approach was working, and that then drove me to be even more engaged in my political party. Opportunities came up, one thing led to another, and I won pre-selection for a position in the Legislative Council.
One of the things that I meant to ask you about before now, and because I wasn't looking at my own notes, I forgot. We mentioned your time in the territorials, in the British Army territorials, but you also were a reservist for many years in the Australian Army, and that must have been a bit more challenging than you might have expected, I suspect, when you first joined it. Was that correct? Because you did mention places like the Hindu Kush.
Yes, the more I was on the journey of senior management in financial services, I always knew that once you become a CEO, your lifespan in corporate life is capped or limited, no matter how good you are. And I wanted to also keep my legal skills up, and I really enjoyed Army life from Edinburgh. So I joined the Australian Army Legal Corps and kept my legal skills current. I eventually ended up with the rank of Colonel, being responsible for all the Army Reserve legal officers across Australia.
And were most of the legal officers actually reservists?
In those days, yes. I think it's changed a little now. And I also had, once I left my CEO role, time on my hands, and before I joined the university, so I volunteered to go to Afghanistan, and I went on 2 occasions. So that was an experience quite late in life. I have conflicted emotions about it. Obviously, I wanted to serve my country, and I'm very proud to have served my country. But my mother, who's now passed, I do feel some guilt of putting her through that worry so late in life. But that is the tension in a person that volunteers for service.
And as I remarked when I was discussing this with you at the beginning, conspicuous service crosses aren't handed out with the Kellogg's cornflakes. And was that for your service in general or for Afghanistan in particular?
Before Afghanistan, that was in relation to general service in the reserve, particularly around the 9th Brigade, which I spent a lot of time giving legal advice to.
Okay, but now you're a Polly.
I prefer senator, or member of parliament.
Yes.
Yes, I'm only joking.
So now you're a senator. The change must have been, although of course you said you were involved quite a lot with your party, so presumably you were involved a little bit with the cut and thrust of politics before you became a...
Yes. The election that I contested to join the state upper house, my party didn't form government, so I did 4 years on the backbench. We then won government in 2018 and the Legislative Council elected me to be the president. I did just under 2 years as president, and then I decided to seek pre-selection for the Senate because a former member of my party had decided to retire from the Senate, and I contested it and was pre-selected. And I remember being pre-selected, then the state parliament nominating me for the Senate, and then being in the Senate a couple of weeks later, I think. It was quite a amazing experience over a few weeks. 1 minute you're sitting in the South Australian Parliament, and next minute you're sitting on the red benches in the Senate, wondering how you came to be there.
Because you were nominated initially, weren't you?
Yes, in a casual vacancy, your party puts your name forward, and there's a joint sitting of the state parliament which nominates you to the Senate. That is generally routine.
Right. You were in power in the Senate.
Yes, I came at the end of the Morrison government as we were leading into the last election. And then post that election, the Senate has a convention that the president comes from the party of government, which is obviously Labor, and the deputy president comes from the opposition. And I was fortunate to be elected by my peers as the Deputy President of the Senate.
That's quite a move for a new boy.
Well, I've had a bit of experience in another chamber. I think that counted for a fair bit.
I'm sure it did. Okay, let's now take another musical break, and we're going to run the next phase into your links with Scotland and your interest in Scotland. So that's a good reason for playing the second group you like, which is a Gaelic song from Caper Cayley. I'm very lucky to be interviewing Senator Andrew McLachlan, and we've talked about his life, the present day, where he's now a senator in the Australian Parliament in Canberra, and he's also, as I said right at the beginning, the patron of the Scottish Associations of South Australia. So how does your interest in Scotland really come from? Because you're not a first-generation migrant, you're a long-time South Australian. How did this develop?
My family's always maintained a strong interest in our heritage, particularly where we came from. The move to Australia ultimately has been successful. I'd like to think so. But it was always impressed upon me to be thankful for those that came before me. And I've also often pondered how difficult it was to take the journey. And I need to live a life of service to pay back their courage for coming here. I see it as almost contractual or kin obligation.
That's a very profound statement. How has it emerged in your actual interest in things Scottish?
I've always had a great interest in Scottish history, and especially the impact of Scottish Enlightenment thinking on the world. As someone who's lived a life in the law, many of the principles come from the thinking of Scottish intellectuals.
Yes, it was an amazing time, the Enlightenment, and one wonders where it all went. Did you explore your own roots?
We have some knowledge of family history, but we know that Colin came from a crofting tenant life from the West Coast. I had to trace back more recently my ancestry the best I could, because I applied for a grant of arms from the Lord Lyon, who was very gracious to grant me arms and informed me that he would make the grant when he was last here in Adelaide. He also gave me the great honour of supporters in my lifetime. So I'm very grateful to his kindness.
Just for people who don't know, the Lord Lyon King of Arms is as they say in Scotland, the Hidian of all things heraldic. If you want to have a new tartan, you better check it out with the Lord Lyon King of Arms. And certainly anything to do with clan histories goes through him. Of course, the McLachlans and I've changed pronunciation because I'm talking about the McLachlans now in the 18th century. They were out in the 1715, in the 15 Rebellion, and the 45, where the clan chief was killed by a cannonball at Culloden. His lands were about to be forfeit, but he was saved. Family was saved by, strangely enough, the Duke of Argyll, who had been on the other side, and he used a legal argument to stop him being attainted, because he was dead before he could be, which was a tight legal argument, I think.
Very, very Scottish.
Okay, so you've actually done a lot of work on this.
Yes, it is difficult once you get back into Scotland because everyone's surname and first name is the same. One thing you learn about the Scots, they're not very original with the first names. It's unusual that my sister and I are called very different names from our predecessors. My sister's Penelope and I'm Andrew. We'll have to blame the 60s and the 70s for that. Also, if they're coming off as the land as a tenant father to be baptised, that could be 3 or 4 years after birth, and perhaps when they have 1 or 2 children, maybe 3, and they get all 3 being baptised. And Colin and his sister Janet were baptised together, so we can't really tell his year of birth. He says, I think, around 1843, I think.
Right.
From memory.
Okay. My name is my grandfather's name, so it hasn't gone away, that.
No, it hasn't. It hasn't. Maybe it will come back.
One of the challenges, I think, about being a migrant is that I think the Scots assimilate very well as migrants, and therefore their kids really become Australians quite quickly. Is that because we're good, and does it matter?
I think the world's changing. We are very good migrants. If you think about my own family, they were strict Presbyterians from the Kirk and would have been bilingual. And since then, we've taken up, I would say, too many of the habits of the Sassenach, and we've anglicised. Now, that was probably necessary in the day in a distant colony and was required potentially for social advancement. Who knows? I think in a multicultural world, there is a greater need for people like myself to reconnect with where we have come and to understand that, to guide us into the future. Being of Scottish heritage is a wonderful gift. Apart from having the best male dress being the kilt, I think, of any nationality, we have such a rich inheritance, which is a privilege, I think, and one worth sustaining, which is why I readily agreed to being patron of the Scottish associations in the state.
And we're very grateful to you for doing that. Hopefully we'll provide a little bit of impetus in the organisation. One of the struggles we have, and we have it in Scottish radio, is that the migrants of the 50s, 60s and 70s who formed much of the backbone of all these organisations are now knocking on a bit, myself included, and we look with a worried frown at where the next generation are going to come from and where they're going to step up. So I know you will provide that little bit of impetus just having spoken to you.
I'd like to think that the next generation spend more time looking at their Scottish history and enjoying it and understanding the journeys of their families. Not often easy to come here from, in effect, poverty and then trying to make a living in a place far, far away on the bottom of the earth in reality.
Yes.
No modern means of communication, waiting for letters from home. Their loneliness must have been great at times, particularly when they came from close-knit communities, similar to the Italian and Greek communities after the war. And also to enjoy the rich cultural heritage, which is fantastic. And you can't not enjoy Scottish dancing, a good ceilidh, or the sound of the bagpipes.
And reading Scottish history, it's a hell of a read, because if you want to look at a country that manages to combine every single emotion in its history, you just have to look at what went on in Scotland throughout the ages.
I've done my part. One of my sons is a bagpiper.
Well, I always wanted to be a drummer, but my left hand and my right hand don't talk to each other, so I gave that away. Andrew, it's been fantastic talking to you. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. I wish you well, both in your patronage of SASA, but also in your political life, because we're very lucky to have you as one of our senators. Thank you very much.
Thank you.